Hello. Today's topic is going to focus primarily on a series of wars for empire fought between England and France. Uh, Up to this point, England has been primarily concerned with building an empire in North America. Uh, at this point now, England is going to be faced with having to defend this colonial empire in North America. And the end result is going to be that these wars are going to have a significantly damaging effect on the relationship between England and its colonies, its 13 colonies here in North America, and will eventually give rise to the many issues that will lead to the American Revolution much later on. So let's get started here. Uh, this term salutary neglect, I mentioned this earlier in the week, but it's more relevant right now as we go into these wars for empire. Salutary neglect basically refers to England's lack of involvement, direct involvement in its colonies in North America. And this happened for a variety of reasons. England, through most of its colonial history, was focused primarily on a big picture. We talked about how the Board of Trade and the previously known as the Privy Council, they were focused primarily on the empire at large as a whole. They weren't focused on any one particular area of the empire, just colonial matters in general. And other distractions at home in England kept England's attention focused on other matters, and not on what exactly was happening in its colonies. So for a long period of time, due to England being preoccupied with other matters, there's going to be a significant lack of regulations and direct involvement in the colonies, especially in North America. This will actually get worse around in the early 1700s with the rule of King George I. What ends up happening is that William and Mary had one daughter who succeeded them and became queen. Queen Anne, their daughter, had no children of her own. So when she dies, there's no one immediately ready to assume the throne of England. So what they start doing is they start looking around for the nearest blood relative who can succeed the throne, and they come up with a distant cousin, George of Hanover. Hanover is a small principality in what will eventually be the nation of Germany. At any rate, this George of Hanover, he's now the King of England in 1714. The big problem is that he doesn't speak any English. He only speaks German. So here now we have another layer of complication added to the highest levels of British government, something else to distract them from what's going on in the colonies. Long story short, this lack of cooperation between the king and the Board of Trade is going to be just something else to keep England's attention focused on something else other than what's going on in its colonies. Over this time period, the colonies will become very accustomed to doing things on their own, to limited self-government. And remember, we talked about this in the beginning, how anything concerning local affairs, the colonies were pretty much free to decide for themselves how to run their day-to-day activities in the colonies. But this long period of time where England is not really directly involved in colonial affairs, the colonies start doing more and more for themselves. They start making more decisions on their own, charting their own course, and over a period of almost 100 years, they are used to doing their own thing. They don't really answer to anybody. And we talked about the Navigation Acts and all these trade regulations that England has adopted over this time period. And there were some attempts to enforce these trade regulations, but it wasn't consistent. It wasn't actively enforced. So despite the fact that there are laws governing the colonies, British laws governing the colonies, they're not really strictly enforced. And so we see the colonies just kind of assuming that they are free to do their own thing. And over time, several generations of colonists, they start to take this for granted. It's assumed that they will always be able to do their own thing and not have to answer to anybody. So this period of salutary neglect is what helps the colonies develop their own sense of independence and self-determination. Now, while this period of salutary neglect has no specific beginning, England never intended to do this. It wasn't part of the plan. It just kind of happened. It will end suddenly and deliberately in 1763. At the end of this series of wars for empire, England is going to be in a situation where it must now start strictly enforcing regulations and start taxing the colonies again as a result of these wars. So this neglect is going to come to a sudden end in 1763. So that's what's going to create a lot of problems between England and its 13 colonies in North America. Before we really get into the specifics of these wars for empire, it's probably a good idea to refresh our memory on what some of the players are doing. We've focused primarily on an English story, the development of these British colonies on the east coast of North America. And this is where we've been focusing our attention for the past couple weeks. But in the beginning, if you remember, I pointed out that France and Spain are still part of this story. All the while we've been developing these 13 colonies on the east coast with England, France has been busy colonizing the St. Lawrence River Valley, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River Valley. And of course, we already know Spain has a long and well-established empire in Central and South America, and of course here they're still present in Florida. But France is our main concern right now. France has this well-established trade network along the interior of North America, and these wars for empire are going to be the result of England and France now competing more directly for control of part of this territory, specifically in this northeastern part of North America. This is where our wars for empire is going to take place, is in this narrow strip of land between the British colonies and the French colonies. So also it's important to note here that there's some important differences between the British colonies and the French colonies. Not just that they are competing with each other, but they're doing totally different activities. They both have very different ideas about how North America should be settled. The British colonies, as we've already discussed, are focused primarily on agriculture. Small family farms in the north, large plantations in the south. In either case, agriculture, farming, requires a significant amount of land. So, and these are permanent settlements, towns and farms, and they're taking up a lot of land, and we see population increasing dramatically over this time period, with more people coming in and building more and more farms. The French, however, and you can kind of tell this from the shape of their settlements here. There's narrow strips of land along either side of these river valleys. The French are concerned primarily with trading. They're trading with the Indians, mainly for furs. French will trade manufactured goods, textiles, tools, weapons, and so forth, for furs that the Indians have trapped and provided to the French. So there's a trade relationship here between France and the Native Americans in the interior. Just the nature of this type of activity doesn't require a lot of land. The Indians are doing most of the hunting and trapping, and the French are just trading in small trading posts that they set up along the rivers and along the lake shores. So we don't see a lot of people and a lot of permanent settlements, mostly just trading posts. Now there are some French farms and French towns along the rivers and the lakes, so there is some farming taking place, but primarily the French are not focused on agriculture. They're focused on the fur trade. Excuse me. So we have very different activities here. To put this in terms of numbers, by the time we get to the mid 1700s, there's about 1.5 million British colonists living in North America over here on the East Coast, compared to only about 85,000 French colonists living in this whole entire region. So just in terms of numbers, the French have a much smaller presence here than the British. So from the Indians' perspective, If you're a Native American living in this region, especially in this region here, uh, you're probably going to get a better deal from the French. You probably prefer dealing with the French rather than the British, because the British, the main thing they want is land for farms. The French, all they want are furs. So as long as a Native American, as long as you're providing furs to the French, they're going to continue trading with you, and they're not really going to want much of your land. Whereas the British, more and more people coming in, they're going to want more and more land. You stand to get a better deal from the French than you do from the British. And this is kind of foreshadowing one of our issues in these wars for empire, is that a lot of the Native Americans in this area are gonna side with the French in many of these conflicts. We'll talk a little bit more how that plays out here in a minute. But again, we just wanted to try to reacquaint ourselves with the two key players in this story, the British and the French. So the wars for empire. There's a series of wars. There's many small skirmishes and battles, but we're focused on 4 of them in general. There's 3 small wars for empire, and then the French and Indian War, which is kind of the climax of this period. But all taking place between 1690 and 1763. Now, before we get deep into this, I want to point out that I don't want you to think of each of these individual wars. We're not gonna talk about individual characteristics of specific wars. We want to think of these as a collection, a series, and we're going to talk about them all as if they are one continuous series. Even though there are 4 separate and distinct wars here, each with their own unique issues, we're going to talk about them as a whole, as a collection, as one single unit. So I will not ask you specific questions about each individual war. I will expect you to know general characteristics that apply to all of these wars. All right, so let's break it down here. In each of these wars, the primary combatants are England and France, and in almost all cases, these wars will begin in Europe over European affairs. In most cases, it's the dispute over the succession of kings in a particular country. Essentially, a king of one country, 2 countries, England and France, will fight over who has the most legitimate claim to the throne of a 3rd country. The king of a 3rd country dies. England claims that one of their people has a right to the throne, and France claims the same thing, and so they fight. So in fact, each of these wars has a European name. The War of the Grand Alliance, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession. Again, they're fighting over who's going to have the most influence in a given country. So there's European issues that start all these wars. But since England and France both have significant colonies in North America, these wars are going to spill over into North America as well. So basically, when the French colonists and the British colonists hear about war in Europe, they're like, okay, we know there's Frenchmen living over in the next valley. We should probably fight them here as well. So the issues here will be a little bit different than the issues in Europe, but it's still England versus France. So in all these situations, the wars begin in Europe and then spread into America. That's one of the characteristics of all of these wars. Since we're focused primarily on the North American component of these wars, that's all we're really going to talk about are the issues that concern us. So when the fighting breaks out in North America, the big goal is dominance of the New England area, that northeastern part of North America, and the Ohio River Valley. These are the 2 big areas of focus. This is, if you remember the map we just looked at, this is where the English frontier and the French frontier are closest together, is in this New England area and the Ohio River Valley. These are the important targets. Almost all of the fighting that takes place in these wars for empire are going to take place in this New England area and in the Ohio River Valley. Speaking of rivers, this is another common characteristic that will be shared by all of these wars, is that the main objective in terms of fighting is going to be the control of strategic waterways. Keep in mind, there's still not a well-established network of roads in North America, so most of the travel still takes place on rivers and lakes. So if you're shipping trade goods or commodities, it's going to be on a boat. If you're moving settlers to a new area, they're probably going to travel by boat. If you're moving troops to fight in a new battle, they're probably going to travel by boat as well. So whoever controls the rivers and the lakes, that country is going to be the one to control the war. So control of these strategic waterways is going to be a very important aspect of the fighting here in North America. Another characteristic that each of these wars will share is that in every case, most of the fighting that takes place here in North America will be done by colonial militia. Back in Europe, the French army and the British army are fighting each other, and of course their respective navies as well. But here in North America, most of the fighting takes place with colonial militia. Now, in the British colonies, English colonies in North America, the militia is almost exclusively responsible for defense. So, and this is the case from the very beginning, from Jamestown and Plymouth, those first colonies. The militia is responsible for the defense of the colony, and this was by design. England didn't have the resources at the time to station troops in America, so they left defense of the colonies up to the colonies themselves. And basically, what a militia is, these are citizen soldiers, just the regular people that live in the town or the colony, farmers, merchants, tradesmen, and so forth. These are the people who will comprise the militia. Kind of like today's National Guard. They're regular citizens who have regular jobs, but in time of need, they serve in the militia. In fact, this is where the American National Guard tradition comes from, is this militia tradition established in this colonial era. So in the British colonies, the citizens themselves, the colonists themselves, are responsible for defense. Now, the thing about militias is that they are not professional soldiers. They have some other regular job they do all the time, and they just serve as a soldier in time of crisis. So they have no training. They're not trained as soldiers. They have no very weak leadership structure. Their leaders are also members of the community, so you don't see them having any kind of leadership training. The commander of the colonial militia he's a businessman from a town in the colony. He has no military training either. So the soldiers are not trained. The leaders are not trained. They're not very well organized, and of course, there's no defense budget in the colony. People provide their own weapons. They provide their own food and materials and supplies. So these are not organized units. So in time of crisis, while they are willing and they are certainly willing and motivated to defend their farms and their colony from attacks, they're not very good at it. And it's not that they're incompetent, they're just untrained and unorganized. And this makes them largely ineffective, especially if they have to fight somewhere other than their own backyard. And that's what we're going to see in the case of these wars for empire, is that the militia are going to have to go away from their colonies to help defend other colonies. When we have French and Indians attacking the British colonies in New England, we're going to see militia from some of the southern colonies moving up north to help defend against the French attacks, and they're just not that effective, and they're not that motivated. If you're defending your own backyard, you're pretty motivated. If you're defending someone else's backyard across town, your heart's just not in it. And the fact that their lack of training and organization and lack of leadership and their lack of motivation makes them really ineffective as soldiers. And here's the problem. The French colonies, these trading posts that we talked about, these fur trading posts, they're small. They're usually centered around a fort. There's a fort at these trading posts along the river. And at every fort, there are French soldiers, actual French soldiers stationed at all these forts. So in the French colony, while there are fewer French colonists than there are British colonists, the French settlements are defended by actual soldiers, whereas the British settlements are defended by the militia, the townspeople. So when the British and French start fighting in the colonies, we have a kind of a mismatched battles. The French are using actual soldiers against the British militia, colonial militia, which are not actual soldiers. So the bottom line here is that over the course of all these wars, in every case, in all of these wars for empire, there will be an increasing involvement of British troops, because when the war begins, the colonial militia is fighting. And of course, they're fighting ineffectively. They're losing most of their battles. And in the end, England will be forced to send British troops to step in and pick up the slack. And this will happen more often, as with each subsequent war, it'll happen more often, and it'll happen to a greater extent till we get the French and Indian War, when we'll see large numbers of British troops stationed here for the first time. And again, it's because the militia is so ineffective. British troops have to start coming here to do the fighting. And this will be a problem later on. After the wars, the British troops are going to stay here, and this is where we get some of our first examples of tension between the American colonies and the British government. Finally, our last characteristic that will be common to all these wars is the role of Native Americans. And this is probably one of the most important pieces of this story. We haven't, there are other key players. We talked about the three main groups of people in our narrative are the European settlers, the African slaves, and the Native Americans. These three groups. So the Native Americans are going to play a major role in this story. It's not just England and France fighting each other. The Indians are playing a role in this story too. And Indians will fight on both sides. Some will fight for the British and some will fight for the French. But in every case, it's important to remember that Native Americans are not just playing a passive role here. They're not just puppets or victims in this story. They have their own idea. The role that they will play in this story is based on their own agenda. They have goals that they want for themselves too. They want to retain control of their land. They want to retain some sort of freedom in terms of determining their destiny. They don't want it to be the French or the British deciding their fate. They want to decide that for themselves. And they'll play a role very often. It's a role of what we call mutual manipulation, where the Indians are kind of playing both sides against each other. The Indians figure that if we can get the French and the British to kill each other, then they'll all go away and we'll be left here with our own land. Of course, that's not always the case. A lot of times they will choose a side based on who they think is going to win. If the British win, well, we want to be on the British side because we'll get a better deal if we're on the side of the winner than the loser. So Native Americans will play a role here on both sides. Most of the Indians that fought with the French are the Algonquin tribes. There's many different tribes that make up the Algonquin kind of a federation. And on the British side, we have primarily the Iroquois. There was again a confederation of multiple tribes that made up this Iroquois confederation. So and the Iroquois and Algonquin were traditional rivals anyway. So again, we see the support from the Native Americans for England and France being divided along their traditional rivalries as well. So that'll play into the story as well. Some of these Indians they'll choose the side of the British because they think, okay, this will be a chance for us to gain an advantage over our traditional rivals in the next valley or whatever. So again, the Native Americans are not just puppets or pawns in this story. They have their own agenda, and they are active participants in this story. We look at our map here. We're kind of zoomed in from the previous map. This map is actually a map of French and Indian War battles, but this map can also be useful for all of our wars for empire because they all share the same characteristics. We talked about control of the New England area, and here we're zoomed in on the New England area. All the battles in these wars, almost without exception, are going to take place in this region of New England. And this is where the British frontier and the French frontier are closest together. In this narrow strip here, there's only about 50 miles between the English frontier and the French frontier. And that's very close. That's just a short distance away. Down in the lower Mississippi Valley and the lower East Coast, the French and British colonies are 500 miles apart. They barely even know that each other exists. But up here in this northeastern area, their two settlements are very close to each other. So we see quite a bit of competition for resources in this area, as far as English settlements wanting more land for farms, the French colonists wanting more area for trading, and of course the Indians stuck right here in the middle. Both the Indians trying to maintain their position in this conflict. They're trying to keep to stay in the game, to keep their interests from being swept away by European interests. So again, we've got here in this close proximity the British, the Indians, and the French, all right here in close proximity to one another. This is where all of these wars are going to focus, at least in the North American part of the war. We see too our evidence of strategic waterways. All the battles that you see on here, these little stars, these are battles that take place in the French and Indian War, but these are the same places where the battles took place in all those previous wars as well. They're fighting over control of the rivers. Particularly these lakes and rivers that connect New York with the St. Lawrence River. So basically, these interior waterways and lakes, these are the primary sources of transportation. So each side wants to control it. Same thing over here in the Ohio River Valley. You've got the Monongahela River and the Allegheny River joining to form the Ohio River right here in this spot. This is present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Right here in this spot is very important. This junction of these three rivers is a strategic location. Whoever controls this spot will command all of these river valleys. A large territory of the interior will be controlled by this one spot. So both sides, both the English and the French, are going to want to control this territory. So no big surprise that a lot of the fighting takes place in this region. All right, the French and Indian War. This is kind of the climax of this series of wars for empire. This is the fourth and final war fought between England and France for control of North America. Now, this war will have a European component as well, but this war, unlike the other three, begins here in the colonies. All the other three wars began in Europe over European issues. And then they spread to the colonies in North America. The French and Indian War will begin here in North America, and it'll eventually escalate into a European war. In fact, other countries will join into this fight once it spreads into Europe, and you could make an argument that this is the first true world war because fighting will take place on two continents. It'll involve multiple nations over multiple territories and a range of issues. So again, this is one of the reasons this is the climax. The result of this war will determine who is the dominant power in Europe and in North America as well. So of course, here in North America we call it the French and Indian War because the British colonies are fighting the French and their Indian allies. So the French and Indians are fighting against the British. Even though there are Indians fighting on the British side, most of the Indians are going to be fighting on the French side, which is why we call it that. When the war escalates into Europe, it's going to be called the 7 Years' War. And other traditional European issues will drive the fighting that takes place in Europe. But here, the fighting will take place and be driven by issues that we've already discussed that were common in all those other wars: the strategic waterways, control of New England area, the control of trade with the Indians, and so forth. So all the same issues are going to apply here in the French and Indian War. This war will have a couple of little differences. One of the things that is going to be significant about this war is that for the first time, these 13 British colonies begin to act as one single unit. Up to this point, each of the 13 colonies thought of themselves as independent entities that didn't have anything to do with the whole, other than the fact that they were all British colonies. They had nothing to do with each other. They didn't think of themselves as unified in any reason. They had their own separate economic activities. Each of them had their own separate relationship with England. So they don't think of themselves as one. We talked earlier in the week about how things like the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening are going to start building some connections among these colonies. These wars for empire will help build some of those connections as well. So when 1754 rolls around, these British colonies are starting to, they've been through this before. They've fought several wars for empire here in North America against the French, and each time they've been through the same set of circumstances. So in 1754, it's pretty obvious that another war is coming. Tensions are building on the frontier. More French are coming. They're expanding their trade with Indians. They're building forts in those along those rivers in the interior. And the English colonies are very nervous about this. Especially the colonial leaders here. Not so much the government back in England, but the colonial leaders here are very concerned about this. So they want to get out in front of this. They see where it's going. They see the writing on the wall. They see that war is coming, and they want to try and get out in front of it before it escalates. So in 1754, this is in May, the colonies get together in Albany, New York, for a conference. This Albany Conference. It's a meeting of leaders from each of the 13 colonies. Now, not every colony sends representatives, but most of them do. Most of the 13 colonies will send representatives to Albany to sit down and discuss how they're going to respond to the French threat. They know that, okay, we've all been down this road before. We've fought the French numerous times in the past couple of decades over territory here in North America. So let's try and form a plan. How are we going to do it this time? What are we going to do? Or let's work together. Now, at this conference, we start seeing in this 1754 conference, we start seeing some of the names that we're going to be familiar with. People like Benjamin Franklin, who is at this Albany conference. Ben Franklin is going to propose an idea here at this conference. Basically, he calls it the Albany Plan of Union. In it, he suggests that they join forces. They pool their resources. They fight together, work together as a single unit. The 13 colonies all working together to resist French aggression in the area. Nothing really comes of this. All 13, all of these representatives at this Albany conference, they reject this idea. They're like, okay, yeah, it's probably a good idea for us to cooperate and work together here against the French threat, but we're not signing anything. We're not going to join any kind of, we're not going to submit ourselves or subordinate ourselves to some central entity that's going to dictate what we do and how we do it. So, a lot of people in Albany in 1754 agree that cooperation is probably a good idea, but none of them are willing to commit to it. And this is important. The fact that they all came to meet together to discuss a common issue is an indication that the colonies are now starting to think of themselves as somewhat unified in a common cause, but they're not ready to commit to it yet. And there's a big difference between agreeing that something is important and then being willing to make a commitment to it. But they all agree that the idea of cooperation is probably a good idea, but they're not willing to stake their future on it. They're not willing to make that commitment to a common cause. So the Albany Plan of Union is dismissed. Nothing comes out of this Albany conference. No commitment is made. Nobody, no agreements are made. Nobody makes any plans for a unified effort against the French. All they do is talk. But even though nothing official comes of it, this Albany Conference is important in our story because it's the first instance where the 13 colonies are starting to think of themselves as having some sort of common cause. Instead of thinking of themselves as going 13 different ways, doing 13 different things, they are now starting to think of themselves as somewhat united in some kind of a common cause. Illustration here to show you that kind of illustrates this point. Benjamin Franklin drew this illustration, and he showed it to people in this Albany conference in 1754. It was printed in a couple of the newspapers at the time. Basically, Franklin is using this cut-up snake as a metaphor for the colonial effort against the French. He's saying that individually, if the colonies try to go it alone in this war against France, they're not going to be very effective, just like they have been in all these previous wars. Just like a snake that's cut up in little pieces is of no threat to anybody, the colonies, of course, each of these pieces of the snake labeled for a different one of the colonies. The colonies, doing their own separate things here, stand no chance of success against the French. The French are better organized. They have actual soldiers. We only have militia. If we try to fight them as individual colonies, we're not going to be successful. And of course, here the point he's trying to make is that if they join together as one single effort against the French, just like a snake that is not cut up in pieces, a snake that is whole and alive is a much greater threat than one that's cut up in little pieces. So again, the metaphor is pretty obvious here. This illustration will be revived several times over the years. Later on, as the 13 colonies start to think of independence against England, this illustration will be revived to become a symbol of the patriot cause. And of course, we see it even recently. Every few years, this illustration will show up on license plates and flags and so forth as kind of a symbol of American unity. And which actually begins before there was a United States. Again, the point Franklin is making here is that they must unite as British colonies against the French. So nobody in 1754, nobody's talking about independence from England. That's not even on anybody's mind right now. They're just thinking in terms of how they might more effectively resist the French threat. And of course, here looking back at our map, Fort Duquesne that we talked about earlier, this is going to be where the first battle takes place in this French and Indian War. At the same time they're having this Albany conference, out on the frontier in the Ohio River Valley, things are starting to heat up. The British colonists got word that the French are building a fort out here, Fort Duquesne, and they know that this area is of strategic value. And the colonial leaders, they're thinking, okay, if we're going to fight another war against the French, we need to go out and stop them from building this fort. We need to control this area instead of the French. So the Virginia colonial government, House of Burgesses, they send the Virginia militia out into the Ohio River Valley to stop the French from building this fort. They're going to task the leader of the Virginia militia at the time was a young lieutenant colonel named George Washington. He's 25 years old. George Washington, here, of course, pictured at the Battle of Fort Duquesne. Washington will lead this Virginia militia out into the frontier of the Ohio River Valley to try and stop the French from building this fort. Unfortunately, the French have already built the fort, and the fort is manned with actual French soldiers. And these Virginia militia are now going to go up against these French soldiers. It's not going to end well for George Washington and the Virginia militia. They're going to be defeated very easily by the French. The French outnumbered them many times to one. Plus, the Virginia militia is untrained. Keep in mind, George Washington himself, as a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, even he doesn't have any military training. Washington was a plantation owner, a gentleman farmer. He's not a soldier. So while he's in command of these troops, he doesn't have any more training than they do. So the untrained, unorganized Virginia militia going up against French troops, it's pretty much a one-sided battle. The French win very easily. And now, in most cases, in a situation like this, a frontier fort, they wouldn't bother taking any prisoners because they don't have the facilities or resources to maintain a prison camp. This is just a frontier outpost. They probably would have just killed all the survivors and then left it at that. But in a strange twist of fate, the French decided to show mercy here, and the defeated Virginia militia was allowed to return to Virginia. Of course, they had to surrender their arms. So basically, George Washington is able to survive this battle and take the remnants of the French, or excuse me, the Virginia militia back to Virginia and live again to fight another day. Had the French decided to execute all these prisoners, our story of American history might have turned out very differently. George Washington might not have been part of our story at all. But at any rate, the war begins here in this Ohio River Valley at the Battle of Fort Duquesne. As word of this will get back to spread to the other colonies, and we'll see the French and the British fighting in more places here in America. And of course, eventually word will get back to Europe, and the French government and the British government will declare war on each other, and other issues will come into the story at that point. But here in North America, the war begins at Fort Duquesne in this struggle over who controls the frontier. Once fighting begins in earnest, we will see a lot of the traditional patterns taking place. British colonial militia fighting the French soldiers and their Indian allies in all the same places that we already talked about, along the strategic waterways and so forth. So the French and Indian War will play out in very much the same way that those other wars for empire did. And it'll just be a little bit larger scale, and it'll last a little bit longer, and in the end, we'll see a little bit different result. A more definitive victory for the British. Basically, when the war begins, for the first couple years, first 3 or 4 years of the war, it's going to play out exactly the way it did in all those other wars. Characterized by British failures, British losses, and French success. And keep in mind, this is due in large part to the fact that in North America, the French have actual soldiers fighting on their side, and of course quite a few Indian allies, whereas the British are relying almost exclusively on militia and very few Indian allies. So for the first few years, this war is going to look just like all the others, with the French having most of the victories. What will eventually happen is that King George II is the ruler of England at this point. George II is going to be very frustrated with this. He's like, okay, we've gone through this so many times before, and with the same result, with our colonies being intimidated by the French in North America. We can't do this anymore, and this is dragged on long enough. We've been fighting this war for 4 years now. We need a more decisive victory. So George II turns to his new prime minister, a guy named William Pitt. Prime minister basically is just he's kind of like the American, kind of like the British equivalent of the American president. He's the chief administrator in Parliament. At any rate, the king is still the king, but the prime minister is kind of the chief spokesman for the elected government in England. At any rate, the prime minister now, William Pitt, is going to kind of take charge of this war in North America. Basically, the king says, "Give me victory. I don't care how you do it. I need a victory over there in the colonies, so we can finally end this mess with the French once and for all, and we can get focused on building our trade empire once again." So William Pitt is like, "Okay, I can get it done. I can do it, but it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be it's not going to be for free." So the king's like, "Fine, whatever. Just make it happen." So William Pitt, he dips into the royal coffers, and he starts pouring money on this problem. He throws a fortune in terms of British wealth at this war, mainly to fund a military expedition into North America. So Pitt marshals the full strength of the British Navy and the British Army, and he sends them to North America to fight the French. In the end, more than 20,000 British troops are going to show up here in North America with the full backing of the British Navy. So basically, all those French soldiers that are here already are going to be isolated. The British Navy is going to blockade all the rivers and the ports, and basically isolating the French troops. They can't receive any kind of reinforcements. The French Navy is not going to be able to get into this area because the British Navy is going to have everything blockaded. And we got 20,000 British troops are going to be going up against the few French soldiers that are in the area. And we're going to see things start to turn around in 1758 with the introduction of all these troops. Now, these are all regular troops. They're professional soldiers. They're trained in combat tactics. Their leaders are all well trained. They're well organized and they're well equipped. Again, Pitt is going to spend a fortune funding this campaign into North America. At the same time, Pitt is going to send word to the colonial governors. Hey, colonial governors, especially in the New England area, you reach out to the Native Americans. You offer them new treaties, and specifically what they offer, they say if you Native Americans will switch sides and join forces with the British, then we will give you a guarantee in writing of your territory. Where British territory ends and where Indian territory begins, we will guarantee that in writing, and we will not take any more of your land. Now, the Indians at this point have just been kind of rolling the dice. They're like, okay, the French look like they stand the best chance of winning this war, so we're going to side with the French. And again, we talked about that and the reasons why. They believed that the French would give them a better deal in the end than the British. Plus, it looked like the French were winning for those first few years, so most of the Indians are on the side of the French. But after this new treaty is evolved, after all the 20,000 British troops show up and the British colonies offer them a different treaty guaranteeing their rights to their land, a lot of the Indians are gonna take this deal. They're gonna say, okay, yeah, it looks like the British are gonna win this war, and plus they're offering us this guaranteed land rights. The Indians at this point are thinking we probably should join forces with the British, because in the end, if the British win, we want to be on the side of the winners. The Indians, they know that the British are going to want more land eventually. They know that the British farms and settlements are going to be more populated than the French trading outposts. But if the Indians stay on the side of the French and the French lose, they're going to get nothing at all. England will just dictate terms and they'll take everything. So the Indians feel that it's in their best interest to side with the British, because at least they'll get something out of this deal. Whereas if they're on the side of the losers, they're not going to get anything. So a new treaty with the Native Americans, coupled with the massive influx of British troops and the British Navy, this turns the war decisively in favor of the British colonies. So in the end, the French are going to lose this war. It'll drag on for another couple years. It'll take the British a while to turn it all around, but eventually they will win, and the French will lose, and they're going to lose big. In 1763, England and France will sign the Treaty of Paris. Now, I told you in the beginning that I don't require you to memorize dates of everything, but it might be a good idea for you to learn the dates of these treaties of Paris, because there's going to be several of them. Over the course of this semester, we'll have 2 or 3 different treaties of Paris, each for a different war, taking place on a different date. So to keep them straight, you may want to remember which date goes with which treaty. So the bottom line here is that France will lose this war, both in Europe and in North America. And as a result, they're going to have to give up all of their territory. Everything that France has possession of in North America, they are going to lose as a result of this war. Taking a look at the map here, we've got a nice before and after of this French and Indian War to illustrate this. Prior to the war, 1754, France controls a large territory. Most of the interior, all along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River, is all controlled by France. England controls basically this between the Appalachian Mountains and the East Coast. A relatively narrow strip of land here on the East Coast. England claimed some area up here around the Hudson Bay, but nobody is really living up here. There's a few trading posts. It's mostly just Indian territory. Same thing with all the territory west of the Mississippi River. This is all, although France claims this territory, there's no Frenchmen out here in the western territory. This is all just Indian territory. So again, on the map, England and France claim vast territories, but no one's really living out here. All the French settlements are along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River. All the British settlements are along the East Coast here. So you have to be careful when you're looking at maps. A lot of times the map suggests that there's a lot more going on here than there really is. And of course, we see Spain still controlling what is today Texas and Mexico, and of course, Florida belongs to Spain as well. At the end of the war, after the war is over and France loses, the map is going to look very different. Basically, France will give up all of their territory in North America. The Great Lakes and Ohio River, Mississippi River Valley, all that was going to be given to England. England is going to now claim all of this territory. Everything that France had in terms of this trade network, all that belongs to England now. Also, England is going to get control of Florida. And the reason this happens is because very late in the war, it's like 1761, Spain decides to join the war on the side of France. Again, these are old issues back in Europe, so Spain sees an opportunity here, so they join forces with France, but it's too late, and it's not effective, and basically Spain ends up on the losing side. So for their role in the war, Spain is going to be forced to give up Florida. So now England controls this massive contiguous eastern half of North America. Everything east of the Mississippi River belongs to England now. What England is going to do too is, as a result of this treaty, they're going to force Spain, or force England. They're going to force France to give up their territory west of the Mississippi River to Spain. Now, the reason they did this is that one, there's no one really living out here. There's nobody doing anything with this territory anyway. Spain at this point is a relatively weak power compared to England and France. Spain is relatively weak, so England is confident that Spain is not going to do anything with this territory either. But they just want to keep France from having anything to do with it. So basically, there are no French territories at all in North America now. France is pretty much out of the story with regard to the settlement of North America. And again, although Spain now controls this territory west of the Mississippi River, they're not ever going to do anything with it. This is all still Indian territory. So basically, this border, the English frontier, is now more secure because Spain, a relatively weak power, is not going to be much of a threat out here on the frontier. So the map looks quite a bit different after the war than it does before the war. Which brings us to our final point here. With effective control of North America, England becomes the most powerful colonial power at this point. Spain, while they still control a vast territory in Central and South America, they're on the decline. They've been on the decline for many years. So relatively, they're a weak power. Their control of Latin America is somewhat tenuous at this point. Not only is England the most dominant power in the New World, they are the most dominant nation in Europe now as well. After having defeated France decisively in this war for empire, England now is the top dog. Their rise to power is complete now. It began back in 1588. In 1763, now England has kind of completed its rise to prominence. They're the dominant force. With that power and control comes a lot of responsibility, though. Yes, England's control in Europe is complete, but in order to maintain that control, they're going to have to maintain a large army and a large navy. Same thing in North America. While England is now the dominant force in North America, if they want to stay that way, they're going to have to put forth a lot of effort to maintain it, to control that territory. You saw the map, how much territory that they now claim. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of resources to control that territory, specifically military resources. England is in a situation now that, by virtue of becoming the most powerful nation in the world, they now have taken on an enormous responsibility. They now have to maintain effective control of this territory. They've got to pay the troops and the Navy. Those things are expensive. To maintain a large standing army and a Navy to control this territory is going to cost a fortune. In addition to that, England is as a result of all these wars, England now has a massive war debt. This cost them a lot of money. Pitt emptied out the treasury to pay for the war, and a lot of money was borrowed to help pay for the war. So England has a massive amount of war debt at this point. Plus, they've got the burden of maintaining this empire. England is going to be faced with a situation where they have no choice now but to start really strictly enforcing their trade laws in order to gain as much profit as they can from their empires. In addition to that, they're going to start taxing the colonies. And this is what's going to set the stage for the American Revolution. England's sudden and deliberate control of trade, the enforcement of all these trade regulations, and the sudden increase in taxation. Both of these things are going to become some of the central issues that will eventually lead to the Revolutionary War. So keep in mind, in 1763, the American Revolution is still about 12 or 13 years away. So nobody's talking about independence right now. But these new taxes that the colonies are going to have to pay, and these newly enforced trade regulations, means that England is going to be sticking their nose in colonial business more and more often. England is now going to be more directly involved in colonial affairs. And keep in mind, all these years of salutary neglect, the colonies are used to doing things their own way. They're used to running their own affairs. Now England is going to be getting involved more directly involved. And this is going to aggravate the colonists. The colonists are now have England looking over their shoulder every 5 minutes, collecting taxes, enforcing trade regulations, and this is going to create a lot of tension in the colonies. So about 10 or 12 years worth of this tension, starting here in 1763, the 13 colonies in North America are going to be seriously questioning their relationship with England. And we know that'll eventually lead to the revolution, which is, and of course, these issues and this tension is going to be the subject of our discussion next week. We'll talk about how England starts to get involved with the colonies and how the colonies start to push back against British involvement. And that's where our story will begin next week. For this week, that's really all we have time for. So next week we start basically our slow march toward the revolution. So we'll see you then.